All right, guys, we want to welcome you again this week, Substitute Teachers Lounge. Now, I will tell you that our guest today is Azariah. Azariah, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm real good. Now, you all think that's a new guest, but we
Yes.
actually had her on the show back on episode 23. I called her Shelby at that time.
Yep.
Uh, she mainly goes by Azariah now, and I think that's great. And you all are going to enjoy today because we're going to talk about how we should treat our students and how sometimes how students are looked down upon by either students or teachers and
Yep.
what we should do about that. So I have a series of questions. I will let Azariah answer those, and I will add to, but I want this to be your show. I don't want it to be mine. So
Yeah.
they're going to be a lot more interested in what you have to say. And I've already told her, feel free to share any personal stories you would like to. That's going to make the show a lot more interesting anyway. I've
Yeah. I
sent her these
appreciate that
questions
very
in
much.
advance. Yes, I've sent the questions in advance so she knows what's coming up. So let's just start with the first one. What trait will help a substitute teacher most in connecting with students?
You have to have an open mind. There is probably, and it's for every teacher, you're going to have a generational disconnect. So how you were raised in schools and how you may have treated your teacher and how that was perceived is completely different now than what maybe you grew up in, or how teaching has evolved over time. So if you don't have that open mind, and if you're not every day making sure that there is a safe environment for your classroom and you're learning new things, and not just cutting yourself off on a bias,
No
um,
doubt.
yeah, then you'll succeed and you'll be a great substitute teacher that people will want to come back. And students will form a relationship with you because they feel like they can have that with you. And that's what we're here for.
Exactly.
That's what our job is, outside of just going in when a teacher needs us. We're there to build relationships so they feel safe around us as well. So
Right, right.
yeah,
I love that answer. I was going to say being receptive. That's basically what you're
yeah,
saying. We have to be there for these students. I am shocked, and I've told you this. I am shocked that students share with me just about anything, and I'm trying
yeah,
to think how in the world. I feel good that they come up to me. Sometimes it's not always situations I can relate to, but I
right,
definitely want to be a receptive and let
yeah,
them know that regardless of what they're into,
right,
I'm not going to be judgmental about it. I want to be listening ears, and we'll go
yeah.
from there. Very good, very good. What mistake do substitute teachers make most often, do you think, when it comes to dealing with students?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of a two-parter. One, I think it needs to be noted, it is okay to make mistakes.
Absolutely.
We are all learning this as we go. Every class, student is completely different. Today's one of the two biggest mistakes that you're going to make that will make a lasting impression if you don't change them and learn from them. The
Okay.
first one is not, again, going back to not being adaptive to what the students are going through and
Right.
having that empathy with them. So you may have a student that is from upper middle class that maybe has an upbringing that's similar to yours, or you may have a student that is from low income. You may have a transgender student.
Right.
And if you immediately block off any sort of learning moment for yourself, um, that's a huge mistake. And the other one is not listening to a student when they ask you to use a different name or different pronouns that are in teachers' instructions.
Right.
That is a new challenge, or I won't say a new challenge, but it is more of a challenge that we're seeing over the last couple of generations, with it being more accepted and more talked about, and it not being a closed door subject. Um, I've I always, when I started doing attendance, I always used they, them pronouns until otherwise noted. Because we didn't actually change pronouns until the 40s. Everyone was addressed as they, them, and then we started using he, she as a identifying marker instead of they, them. So fun
Right.
historic fact for you.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, you have to be able to learn that, and you have to be you your religious beliefs aside, from 8 a.m. to 4 or however long your school day is, you need to provide a safe place. And the worst thing you can do is say, well, your name says David, you might want to go by Catherine, but I'm telling you that you're in this class, you are this name, and I'm not going to change it.
Right.
I had a student. It was so funny. It was actually my first long-term sub job, and this was a middle school student, and they had been switched out teachers the entire time. So they did not have a long-term sub that was working with them.
Okay.
So the first long-term sub that they had would not budge. I don't know another word to use outside of was not very
Open-minded.
yeah, open-minded. It just was very, it was her way of thinking, and that she taught her way of thinking to the class. And these were sixth graders. Come in me, and I'm a long-term sub for 6 weeks. I was there for 6 weeks, long-term sub for them. So this is the longest they've had a teacher. And the first thing I said once we started getting comfortable around week 2, I had a student that came up and said, we did questions hour. So it was Friday questions with Miss Journey. So you can ask me any question and we'll go from there. And they said, oh, are you married? And I said, well, yeah. Well, how long have you and your husband been married? I said, actually, my wife and I have been married for almost 2 years. At the end of the class, I had a couple students come up and said, I actually go by they, them pronouns, or different pronouns, or a different name. And the substitute teacher wouldn't do that. Can I feel safe enough in this class to do it? And I did. And it took me an adjustment period to go from what I was calling them to they, them, and making sure that I was practicing that. And they, at the end of 6 weeks, I felt bad for leaving. Even though they had hired a teacher and they were going to be in a stable classroom, they felt comfortable enough to tell me that and feel comfortable enough with who they were at to do that. And that, if they didn't have that, so they were in a stressful environment with stressful situations, and you can't learn like that. So it was just a little easier. It made me feel really glad that they felt comfortable enough to talk to me as sixth graders about things like that. So
Right.
yeah.
And I've tried to use they, them as well with this podcast,
Yeah.
if for no other reason, to try to keep some, not individuality, but some privacy, because if I'm talking
Right.
about something that happened with the student, I don't want to identify
Yeah.
too closely, because I don't want that to be obvious who I'm talking about.
Right.
So I use it in that way as well. I try to
Yeah.
stick with they, them in that way as well.
Yeah.
Good, very good. Let me ask you this. What types of students do you see? Let me start out by, let me embellish my own side a little bit. I know
Okay.
sometimes students are looked down upon for various reasons,
Yep.
uh, including whether they dress as nicely as other students,
Yeah.
whether they might have uh, a weight problem, whether
Right.
they might have sometimes. I actually had a student, and I ended up getting very close to them before this was a longer term time. They got very comfortable talking to me, even though a lot of them would look down on the student because
Hmm.
they had a bad habit of not bathing often.
Yeah.
So they would get what are the various different ways you see kids get looked down upon,
Man, I
but
mean,
by
I think,
either students or
yeah,
teachers?
students or teachers, I think there is, I mean, all of the things that you said, I mean, there's so many just universal factors that children are looked down upon. So their
Yes.
dress, their way, their, hair's cut, if they're clean, if they have money for lunch,
Right.
if they don't have money for lunch. They're also judged by their parents activity within the class.
Yes.
So it kind of, it does go more into what are the parents providing for the classroom, and children will be judged based off that as well. You're going to see children based off their, judged off their sexuality at this point,
Yes.
judged off gender, if there is a transition or if they're non-binary, which are, I know, some new terms that maybe some people aren't aware of yet. But it's no longer, I don't think it's ever been judged based off just academics.
Yes.
There's
That's
so
true.
much
Good point.
and I think something that's important for us to learn is that we all come with a pre-bias. Um, there is some sort of pre-bias that we have been taught in our lives, that we do one of two things with. We either learn to change that pre-bias and question why we have it. So if you're raised in the South, or if you're raised in, West Coast, there's always that bias, right?
Sure.
Our
Absolutely.
South, I had an aunt that was from the North, and when we would joke around with her, she was the Yankee aunt, and
Yes.
that's just a joke at pre-bias, but
Sure.
there's something to be said to that. And for me, as a student who came from a lower class and struggled with food, as a teacher now, I have such a hard time watching full-time teachers judge students based off income.
Me too.
I worked at one day, and I've never been back to this school because I didn't make a scene, but I got pretty upset. There was a young man, and this was middle school ages. So I came in, had him for most of the day, took him to lunch, and he didn't have money for lunch, and he didn't have a packed lunch. So a friend of his, I don't know if it was a little girlfriend or just a friend, you know how middle school is, girls,
Sure.
that's just how it is, went to give him pay for his lunch, and a teacher stopped her and said, no, go sit down. And she went back up to go get a slushie, and the lunch lady said, didn't you already buy a slushie? I don't think you can buy two. And she tried to whisper, no, I'm buying it for this so-and-so so he can
Oh,
have it.
yeah.
And the teacher said no. And this was in front of an entire cafeteria full of this young man's grade, and said, if you have money to buy a slushie, then you have money to pay the debt that you owe the school for lunch. Go sit down. And
Wow.
I walked up, and you think, subs, you carry a couple dollar bills sometimes to get you a Coke or, to whatever you need. And I said, hey, how much do you owe? Because I was just going to pay it off. And the teacher turned around to me, and it was a male teacher, said, and at the top of his voice said, no, and took the student, turned him around, and then gave him a bashing in front of all these kids about how
Wow.
you're going to, pay the debt. And students were looking at me like, oh, she's going to let him talk to her like that. I'm going to be able to talk to her however I want the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Gave it a couple minutes. And he walked back over and sat down and shook his head. And I said it loud enough. So, because then at that point you have to say it loud enough like he did, right? And I said, if you ever feel like you have some authority to speak to me like that again, we are going to have a personal problem. You've completely embarrassed this student for no reason, and there's no reason why somebody can't pay this kid's debt.
Right.
And I never was invited back to teach there. But that school had a pre-bias for a specific type of student. And I had a problem with it and called it out. And you're going to find that.
That's good. Really good. That's a good story, or a bad story, depending on how you want to look at
Right.
it. Let me ask you this, because it kind of leads into that. I'm going to read it exactly the way I wrote it and sent it to you. Let's see here. What should we be an advocate for students, even if that means upsetting some teachers? And
Yes.
you really just shared a story that's a representative of that. Go ahead and answer the question. I'll share a story of my own.
Yeah, I feel like if we're not advocating for students, what are we doing?
Right.
What is our point? We go around to every school in the district. our job is to make sure that students feel safe and that they have a safe place with us. If
Yes.
there are teachers who are not advocating for students, there is a bigger problem, and we have to be a part of the solution.
Right.
That's as simple as it is. If you're not doing that, then you're a part of the problem, and you need to address that within yourself.
Totally agree. And I will say it two ways. I will say what you just said. We should always be an advocate for the students if we feel like we see them treated unfairly in that way. But also what I've noticed a lot of times, just students that get behind and aren't allowed to participate in some of
Yep.
the other things. I think sometimes if we're not careful, that can go too far. I
Of
understand
course.
they have to get their work done, but I've actually stood up for kids that have been in that situation before. I could have done it much more diplomatically.
Yeah.
And if I had to do it over, I definitely would have done it in a different fashion. But I could tell those students appreciated me. I don't want them to appreciate me in a way that, Mr. Collins was a jerk for us. I want
Right.
them to appreciate it in a way that Mr. Collins really stood up for us, and I appreciate him for that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to be careful with your emotions and not, take as
Yeah.
much of a diplomatic approach as you can.
And I think there's something to be said for you saying, you know what, yeah, work needs to be done. And maybe there's a group of students that don't feel comfortable with getting their work done because of the environment that they're in. So after that 6th grade long-term job, I was at the same middle school and went to the 8th grade side. There's a group of 8th graders, I'm telling you, would not do their work for anybody, but they did it for me. And every teacher was like, what are you doing why are they getting their work done with you? Why do they respect you when they see you walk down the hall? Why do they want to come talk to you? And I'm like, what are you doing as a teacher? And I'm a substitute teacher, right? So I'm not with these kids every day. And when I am with them every day, it's for 2-3 weeks at a time, right?
Right.
What I noticed is that those 8th grade teachers had gotten the scoop from teachers, 6th, 7th grade teachers, and already had a pre-bias on those kids. Those kids did not have a chance when they walked in the door. And those kids knew it. And if those kids don't have the expectations that I gave them, you don't get your work done.
Right.
We're not going to have fun. We're not going to be able to have fun at the end of the day or have a good time after lunch. And they got their work done, and they got their work done because they wanted to learn, not because they felt like they had to have a good time. So,
right.
yeah.
That's good. Boy, I can tell time fly. I remember
It
this the
always
last
does
show we
with
did
us.
too. I think we both enjoy talking.
We do.
That's one of the things, but I always enjoy our interaction. So let's close with this question. I
Okay.
wanted to make sure we got this one in here because you hinted at it a little bit in what you were just talking about. What's your reaction when you go into a classroom for the first time and you may have been warned
Yeah.
about a certain student, not so much, personality wise or anything
Right.
like that, more from a standpoint of this student will probably give you trouble. I
Yeah.
want you to be aware of that. What's your reaction to that? And how do you change your mindset when you hear something
Yeah.
like that?
I have learned that any sort of warning I get before I go into a classroom, I throw out the door because those kids are starting fresh with me. So I don't know if Billy is going to scream and sing at the top of his lungs all day. I know I've been warned that he may, but Billy may just do it because Miss Smith picks on Billy and there's
Yes.
an issue, right?
Right.
But what I try to do is if I get warned about a particular student, I make it a point to be as nice as I can to that particular
Good.
student
Good.
and to see what an underlying issue is. And most of the time, what I found out is the troubled students that I'm warned about, like I was warned about my middle school class I came into from the other sub that said, you're going to have a rough time with this group of students. They don't do XYZ. When I came in the first day and gave my little I'm here for the next couple weeks speech, I said, now what can we do to make this better? And the student said, well, she had based the substitute teacher, the other long-term substitute teacher, basically told a group of students who were not originally born from America that they better stand for the flag or they would be kicked out of class, and that they, more than anybody, needed to be the most patriotic and not have an opinion in 6th grade. And I just remember going, oh my God, what have I just walked into?
Right.
I'm just teaching English class. I did not
Right.
6th graders. So you have to sweep all that pre-bias away that they had and said, look, I'm just here to do work. You're here to do your work.
Right.
We'll go from there. And if you're a rough student, boy, let's figure out what we can do to make you a non-rough student for the next couple days, because I don't drink wine and I ain't got wine at home to try to relax from it. And it's funny because I'm young enough that a lot of the students in our city, I can very easily, and sometimes it's very accurate, I can go, I know your mom. I know so-and-so. And they're like, well, what's my mama's name or whatever? And I'm like, your mother's name is this, and I have her cell phone. Do I need to text your mom? And like the class will just be like, oh, if she knows Jake's mom, then she knows Daryl's mom. And
Right.
You know what? No, we're going to be good. And then they'll say, what kind of music do you like? What kind of stuff like that? And you can have that kind of pre-bias, that bad kind of notation put aside, and then you have the best class you'll probably ever have.
Right. That's good.
And you'll have fun stories.
You answered it the same way I would, basically. I mean, I like to, if I'm in a situation like that, I consider it a challenge. And I've shared this before on another episode, but I had one overall class that I saw notes that this was the worst class of the day. And I said, I'm going to strive, without making it hokey, I'm going to strive to see if I can get them to be the best class of the day. And they were so much so that I actually let one of the students write their positive evaluation. And I said, as long as I agree with it, I will sign it and give it to them. So you're just like me in that regard. Well, our time is up, but feel free. What would you like to share with us before we get out of here?
If I can share one thing just from my heart, not as a substitute teacher, but just as a human being living in this world, that, just from one human to the next, be as kind as possible to these kids.
Oh, man.
Love these kids. Treat these kids with the utmost respect, regardless of religion or sexuality or gender, because we don't know what their home life is like. And if you can be the only person that day to make them feel like they care and make them feel valuable and wanted, you could have saved someone's life. And you don't know that. And in 20 years or I look back 12 years and I can name 3 teachers that saved my life because they were kind.
Right.
And not because they were greatest teachers in the world, but because they were kind human beings.
Yes.
So that's what I want to leave you with. Greg, we all know that you're a kind human being, and we talk way too much every time we're here. But yeah, thank you so much again for having me on, and thank you for respecting my name change. I can't say thank you enough for that as well. So.
Oh yeah. In fact, I wouldn't have even said anything opening without asking you about that first. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You have the greatest of weeks, and hopefully, when we get to August, we'll all get back to what we really enjoy.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys stay safe. Thank you so much.
All right. Talk to you later.
See ya.